Hello, I'm Malcolm Haslett.
And I'm Janice Baker. Welcome to this special episode of Our Time. There is a lot of confusion about the issues discussed around Australia's First Nation peoples.
In this episode, we meet Alice Springs councillor Jacinta Price to discuss her life and her opinion on this confusing issue. And fortunately, I had the pleasure of meeting Jacinta on her national tour, and while she was at my theatre.
Yes.
So I took the opportunity to record this interview with her. Now, you may not agree with some of her thoughts or her opinions on what First Nation people should be doing for the future and how the rest of the country needs to be addressing the issues that are being brought up. However, this may make it a little clearer for you, hearing both sides of the argument.
Very good.
Welcome, Jacinta. Thanks for being part of Our Time.
Thank you for having me.
Jacinta, what is your background? Because it's not that you're controversial as such, but it's more that people probably don't really know your backstory.
Sure. Well, I was born in the Northern Territory in Darwin, lived on Melville Island as a youngster. My parents were teachers up there on those islands. I have a connection to that place, the Aboriginal way, where your baby spirit comes from the land and into your mum's belly when you are conceived or when your mother first realises she is pregnant with you. So I have crocodile dreaming, which is the dreaming up there on Tiwi country. They regard me as family. My mother is Warlpiri, however, from a place called Yuendumu, which is 300 kilometres northwest of Alice Springs. And my father is, I'll use the terms whitefella and blackfella because that's just how we talk. He's a whitefella from Newcastle, New South Wales. And from the Tiwi Islands, we moved to the Kimberley when I was still a little one. And from there, I grew up in Alice Springs. So I've grown up with a Warlpiri mum and a white Australian dad. And
well, that's two cultures to start with.
That's two cultures to start.
Did they ever clash when you were young?
Yeah. I think our lives have been about trying to figure one another out. Well, mum and dad trying to figure each other out and me being the medium between them both.
Interesting.
And certainly I think the biggest challenges came from cultural differences and navigating our way through those differences. And look, we still navigate our way to this day. But given that mum and dad are still together after all these years, I think it's a pretty good indication that we've done all right.
But that's part of your story, really, isn't it? It's trying to bring everybody together rather than trying to separate. Absolutely. I think one of the hardest things for all of us to understand is genuinely with the things that are being put before the Australian public from, in a way, to me, one side of the Australian public, which is the First Nation or Aboriginal part. But I know this has been said to me a lot, but the people talking don't look that Aboriginal anymore.
There is that element. There is... I think a lot of Indigenous issues are brought across by many people who aren't engaged with traditional cultural values and traditional cultural way of doing things. Many of those people are removed from that way of life. So understanding the very, traditional way that Indigenous people live and think and do things in a cultural context, regular Australians really don't get the opportunity to understand what that is about.
No, I agree. I think it's very difficult because we hear sort of this side of the equation, if you like, that there are so many different countries within Australia. Is that the correct terminology? Or mobs within Australia or family groups? And everybody has a different opinion on perhaps the creation story, perhaps the tribal way of living. How does that all come together? How does that make one whole story?
From language group to language group, we're culturally and linguistically varied. I guess you could liken it to Europe in some ways.
And it's my very thought, actually. I was about to say that.
Yeah, so, there are some things that, hold true to us in general terms.
You're not going to say, hang on, you're not going to say that Tasmania has to have a Brexit, with all of that.
No, I think Victoria has to. No.
Oh, no, they have to be detached.
That's the one. No, no. You know, the fact remains that we are different language groups, and then within those language groups we have our own different family groups, and within those family groups we are individuals as well. And far too often this idea that we all think with one brain, there is one Aboriginal viewpoint, has for a long time been entrenched into the minds of non-Indigenous Australians, and I think it's caused a lot of problems for us as Aboriginal people. And for me, trying to speak out again, go against the grain as an Indigenous person, I'm called a traitor and a sellout and all those sorts of things, but I don't. Because I have Indigenous heritage and I'm half Indigenous, doesn't mean that I'm beholden to the rest of Indigenous Australia or that I'm owned by Indigenous Australia. And we've got to get away from that way of thinking, I believe. I think it's very detrimental to trying to move forward and do things differently.
What about your father's side? Does he feel that it's gone too far your mother's way, or does he feel he needs to be thought of in this equation as a representative?
You know what? Sometimes I think he should be, yeah. And sometimes he does miss out because he's considered the boring old white fella in the equation. As it's funny because when you're part of such a family, I mean, generally it is thought that non-Indigenous people shouldn't have a voice in Indigenous affairs. But when your family are Aboriginal people, even if you're non-Indigenous, you love those people. You want the best for those people. If they're your family, you should be able to have a say in decisions regarding their lives, their well-being. And so my father has felt like he's been discriminated against as being the white fella of the family. And he has been discriminated against for being that. Which is wrong.
And has that's actually been obvious within your life, do you feel?
There have certainly...
When you've been in a community?
I mean, there's definitely been moments where that has happened. And it's more sort of outsiders from other groups who would probably have had a go at my father. You got no right, you're a white fella, you can't talk about these things. And my mother's turned around and defended him and said, well, no, he has. He's been there. He's been there and supported our family, and he's carried, the caskets of those that we have lost at funerals, and he's shed tears and he's bled for our family because he's another human being who loves.
Well, that's very much the truth, isn't it? We all live on the same rock, dropping through space. We all breathe the same air. We all drink the same water. So what's so different about us?
It's all up here. It's the way we think. That's what makes us different. But we all suffer the human condition. Each and every one of us all do. And we've all had our own life experiences. And sometimes I think the political way of thinking and the ideology that's pushed makes out as though Indigenous people are the only people in the world that have suffered. But the truth is all human beings have.
Well, that's true. If you look at the migration of the world, which is constantly an ongoing thing, every country's really been conquered by somebody at some point. It's all very fine for me to say as a white Australian but I consider myself a stolen generation white Australian because I was an adopted child, taken away from genetic mother because it wasn't the right thing for an unmarried woman to have a baby.
Absolutely.
So I could complain the same thing within our society,
Yes.
I guess.
That's right.
And I see a parallel in that.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what has to be recognised, I think, and is the understanding that all human beings have been through all this level of suffering. And at those times in our country's history where it was occurring to Indigenous people, it was also occurring to non-Indigenous people. In my talk that I've given, I've pointed out the fact that my own ancestors were dispossessed of their land. My white ancestors, they were completely and utterly removed and brought here as convicts. They didn't want to come here. They were brought here against their own will.
It's very true.
And
actually, I've never thought of it in those terms either. But that's an absolute truth, isn't it?
That's right.
They weren't in a position to make the choice.
Exactly. And the more that we can understand that we're all part of this together, I think we can start to go, well, what you're suffering from is what other human beings have suffered from. There's ways out of this, and we're all capable.
Well, education is obviously the way out of everything, really.
Absolutely.
So what do you want to see happen in Australia? What would you like to, what's the ideal situation for the future?
Well, I'd like for my people to understand and take on education as a priority for our children, because if you don't understand the tools that will help you navigate a modern world in order for you to survive, but not only survive but thrive, you will suffer and you will die. And education is that tool for human beings in the modern world. And I'd also like education to be taught properly across this country for all children instead of ideology. I'd like for education to be taught, and I'd like for for Aboriginal women and children's human rights to be upheld, because we're separated, often because of the fact that we belong to this ethnic group. I'd like to be recognised as human beings and our rights upheld.
Do you think that we as white Australians don't really know the history of the country?
I think all Australians don't necessarily know the history of the country in its entirety.
I agree, but hold that thought, and we'll be back in just a moment with Jacinta. Welcome back to Our Time. We're talking with Jacinta. Jacinta, we were just talking before about basically education and how all of Australia really doesn't know the full story. Part of that, from my understanding, is that some of the history and some of the cultural things are sort of secret men's, secret women's business. Is that going to be a wise thing for the future?
Well, I think in some ways the idea of secrecy hinders my people. I think, for the idea of men's business, I think it has certainly been used as a means of controlling women in traditional cultural terms, and has been detrimental for a lot of my people. I think once upon a time it worked, in a society where knowledge was wealth. Your stature grew the more you sort of knew. So that's why.
Well, it's basically education.
It's basically
at the
education.
End of the day, isn't it?
That's right. And it's a different way of thinking too, education nowadays. And education is for everybody. And the idea that, this is a Western construct that's detrimental for Aboriginal people, that's a complete and utter lie. Education belongs to everyone. And if you look at people in third world countries, they would do absolutely everything to ensure that their children gain an education so they can survive the modern world.
Is it a fight, though, for the parents of the younger generation who really didn't have that opportunity, so they don't really know the answers to how to get the right education?
I think the parents of this current generation of kids were sort of in a lost generation. I think the generation before them, their parents' generation, like my mother's generation, did gain there were a lot of Indigenous people who did get good education because they were in the setup of the missionary, education style.
So we're talking about people like Lois O'Donoghue?
Yes, absolutely. That generation of Aboriginal people, a lot of those people got a good education, and it was the generation after that where government sort of went, we're going to get rid of the missionaries, let Aboriginal people do as they please, and here have welfare coupled with alcohol and those sorts of things.
Well, that's not really understanding, is it?
No.
It's the government not understanding.
That's right.
Do you think that's the issue now, the government isn't understanding?
And I think there is the government not understanding so much, but also feeling a sense of guilt for our country's history.
Well, they're probably made to feel guilty because of, I guess, the backlash that's coming through. And once it hits government, then there has to be a committee formed, and there has to be an investigation, then there has to be some form of treaty. And that's confusing, I think, to us, because I don't know what the voice means, and I'm not sure what the Uluru Statement is all about. Can you praise what it is?
Well, I'm trying to picture, bring it all together myself and understand what it's supposed to be all about. And I don't think those who are pushing for it know exactly what it is all about.
It feels like a good idea, but hasn't been explained enough. Is that?
It completely and utterly lacks in detail. Why would you push for something that has no detail whatsoever as to what it is and what it hopes to achieve and how it hopes to achieve what it hopes to achieve? Like I said it before, you wouldn't go to a private investor with a concept and say, please give me money without a business plan behind it. You would not do that.
But that's the modern world's attitude. Is that the right attitude to take to a race of people who have been around for so long with their own built-in culture? Or has that culture been lost in the mix, do you think?
The culture has not had the opportunity to catch up with what's happened with the modern world. You know, the world has changed incredibly quickly in a short amount of time.
Well, it has, and I was thinking when I knew I was going to be talking with you, what's the infiltration of mobile phones in Aboriginal communities?
It's huge.
So you would think that because of that, they can tap the rest of the world. Everyone can tap the rest of the world.
You can tap into the rest of the world, absolutely. Again, but how do you... They haven't discovered the way of how to take advantage of what exists in the modern world in order to, you know, better place yourself, in order to create opportunities. You know, things like the cash economy. You know, any regular Australian doesn't know how to budget, you know, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a paycheck-to-paycheck basis.
Isn't that what credit cards are for?
But yeah, look, my mob haven't been able to understand what all that means. They haven't been given the opportunity to take advantage of those
when
tools.
you see a child with a screen, and I'm talking 2-3-year-old children, they can navigate their way around and find all sorts of things all over the world.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting comment to say, how long will it take for an Aboriginal culture or any culture to quickly assimilate into a world culture because of the internet? I remember some years ago I was in Egypt and talking to a chap in the street, and he was saying how they couldn't get out of Egypt and they wanted people's email addresses so they could communicate with the rest of the world to find out what was going on in the rest of the world. Do you think that's going to change? It's a big question, but do you think the ability to be able to get out of your community by way of that screen is going to affect?
I don't know, because I mean, there is the internet, and there's the downside and the upside to it all, and unless you really know, again, how to make the most of what it is that you've got in front of you.
Comes back to education, doesn't it?
Absolutely comes back to education, and that adaptation process is still needing to take place.
But is that perhaps one of the areas that government should be looking at, as to how to communicate directly with people rather than perhaps making these...
Absolutely, in a more honest sort of way, in a way that's going to be practical and assist, and not in a roundabout tiptoe, let's not upset people kind of way.
Well, it's difficult. I must say, it's very difficult if you're white to know how to address... Is it First Nation? Is it Aboriginal? Is it the name of the group? Is it the mob? How do we talk?
I know, right? And we should just be able to call each other human beings. I guess, you know, I have a problem with how once upon a time, you know, you could use the term Aborigine, and now apparently it's offensive. And I don't know why it's offensive, because it sounds offensive, but it's not. It's not, in my view, offensive. But as soon as people start saying words are offensive, then that's when vocabulary changes, and that's when the emphasis is placed on how to address one another instead of how to address these problems we've got.
True. The understanding at the moment, particularly in council and government, of thanking the original inhabitants of the land, where did that all come from?
Well, as far as I know, that was a demand made on Ernie Dingo some time ago from some islanders who came here and said, look, we do this thing called Welcome to Country. We want one from you Aboriginal people. So they made it up on the spot, and then that was adopted by Aboriginal people around the country, but it's not traditional.
It'd be interesting to find out that if that's the actual background of it, isn't it? Because Ernie Dingo has been such a leader in so many ways in the country, in the film industry, in television. I don't think of him as anybody but Ernie Dingo.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's very much Ernie Dingo. And he's kept that persona. He's somebody, from an Australian's point of view, and I mean Australians' point of view, that's just got on with the job.
Yeah, and who's just another Australian. Like
Seems to me that's what you're doing. So what job is it you're heading towards? Prime Minister? Perhaps?
Well, that would be wonderful if that came about one day.
But you do have political aspirations, obviously.
Certainly. I think you know, I'd like to be involved in where the big decisions are made. So my I see my role as about creating understanding no matter where I go, and particularly in Canberra is where more understanding needs to take place than anywhere else in the country. Although it needs to take place everywhere.
But thinking about it, Australia now has virtually a mix of all world religions, including the Aboriginal way of thinking about creation and I guess life and death. The country has now so many different things all coming in. There's been a Muslim problem, but it's not really a problem. It's just a perception of a problem. Do you think the media is causing that problem by inciting stories?
The media have got a lot to answer for.
Not us.
Not you guys, no. And you know, I mean, they've pushed this idea for a long time that Aboriginal people just have one voice. They, you know, I mean, they made me out to be Islamophobic in the lead up to the election simply because in 2014 they went through my Facebook and found a video that I shared of an ex-Muslim woman who was sharing her story of her oppression within her culture and her religion. And because I shared that, I'm somehow Islamophobic. So ultimately, the media like to have their own narrative, and if you're against that narrative, they'll try and shut you down.
Look, I admire you for what you're standing for, very much so. And I think you've answered a few things that I was unsure about. And hopefully that's done the same for you, that this young lady, you should follow her career and just see where she ends up. Jacinta, thank you so much for being our very special guest.
My pleasure.
And good luck for the future.
Thank you.
I found Jacinta really interesting.
Yeah. Well, it just gives you a side of the story.
I think the real problem for all of us at the moment is really understanding what this is about. And I think she was able, for me anyway, to give me a clearer understanding of her situation, because I've never actually heard anybody talk about their white father or mother before.
Not probably many of us haven't either.
No, and a lot of First Nation people identify as First Nation, which is fair enough.
Yes.
But in a lot of cases, they have a Caucasian other parent.
Yeah.
And I've found it really interesting, her talking about the fact that her father was often not accepted as part of the family, and Mum used to say...
Because they were different colours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mum used to say, no, he's same as us.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the most important thing for all of us to understand. We all live on this rock, as I said to her, and we all breathe the same air and we all drink the same water. We all really need to get on with each other and, you know, find a happier medium, I guess. But for us, Janice, this program has been airing around Australia for almost 10 years.
Yes.
And we
would have ever thought?
We are now up to episode 393. It's 3, isn't it, Phil?
4.
394. Phil's our floor manager.
We think.
And very soon we'll be heading towards our Christmas show. And we have a few surprises from a lot of the guests that have been on our program in the last 6 months, with a Christmas message coming up. And early next year we'll hit the 400 mark.
And that could be very special.
It could be, because the crew that make this show happen, the makeup people, the directors, the studio manager, and everybody here at the Adelaide Uni, the McGill campus of Adelaide Uni, and some of the guests that have been special to us we'll be remembering in that episode. But that probably won't be happening until next year. So thank you so much for being with us for so long. And it's almost time for us to say goodbye,
It is. Shall we sing a song?
Why not? Which would you like to sing? We have quite a broad palette of songs to sing.
I don't know why I said that. I was thinking more of the 400 episode. We've got time to practice.
Oh, okay. All right. You could sing, You Belong to Me. That's not true.
No, it's not.
We sang that in a show a very long time ago, I recall. Because the story is Janice and I have worked together since we were both quite young.
Very young.
Quite young. We've been married, engaged. We've not even known each other in some of the shows, which we were talking about before. Anyway, enough of this rubbish from us.
Yes.
Keep yourself nice till we see you next time.
Take care. See you.
Bye.